Live. Natalie, we're
Are we
actually
good?
live. Yes, we're good. Hi, everyone. If you can see and hear us, tell us in the chat, y'all, because Natalie and I, oh, yes,
Is it alive?
we are definitely live. And now I'm having to
Okay.
mute myself in another window. Amazing. We're too live, Natalie. Y'all, we just did a full minute and a half show for no one, and it was really exciting. Thank you for joining us for the actual live version of week 4. I know this because I already asked Natalie on the previous fake out stream that we did
Yeah.
of Bit Project, Bit Camp. Now, Bit Camp and Bit Project, as we kind of let the students trickle in, of course, and maybe some people joining us from Twitter, maybe a new thing for some folks who are joining us who aren't in the program. But I came to know Bit Project through working with their previous BitCamp cohort, where I met Natalie, who is joining me today, who is a graduate. What do we call you? A graduate of BitCamp? Let's call it
Yeah,
that.
sure.
And Natalie has come back and she is teaching this current cohort of BitCamp students through Bit Project. And they're learning all about Azure Functions, the Spotify API. We're learning about cognitive services. We're doing all sorts of things. Now I'm trying to remember what were the previous things that we learned. With Bo, we played with some cognitive services stuff, some beard detection, I think. And
Yeah.
then what else have we done? What else have we covered in the first 4 weeks, Natalie?
We've covered the different types of Azure functions and how to make one and how to make requests to one that you've already created.
Yes. And big Azure Functions fan here myself. Very, very excited because, and correct me if I'm wrong, Natalie, the students of Bit Camp, I keep just saying Bit Project Bit Camp, the students of BitCamp are going to be making some Azure Function-based projects at the end of this BitCamp, correct?
Yeah. They should be getting started
And what was
very
your
soon.
project that you made when you went through BitCamp?
I did like a web page that gives you song recommendations based off of a picture of your face.
What a coincidence, because today we are using that API that you used for your project, correct?
Yep. The
Wow.
Spotify API.
A full circle moment here. The teacher,
Mm-hmm.
the student has become the teacher. I'm so excited that you're going to walk us through this today. I just wanted to share a couple other of my favorite Azure Functions projects out there before we go along with the lecture. While we have a couple of people join, I'm just going to check. Feel free to ask us any questions, y'all, along the way as we're going through this tutorial today. I'll have the chat open live over here. But I just wanted to mention, check out my Dev2 post for Bo. Shout out to Bo, who's in the chat right now. Bo was in the previous cohort as well, who's also teaching in this cohort. He's joined us in some of our previous lectures, and he built a whole IoT project using Azure IoT and Azure Functions. And now I'm super excited because I have to admit something, Natalie. APIs can scare me. I think this is because sometimes, and correct me if I'm wrong, and voice in the chat if you agree, sometimes documentation can be really bad. And I've been burned before. I have had to use APIs with not so great documentation. It's really easy to get lost in the weeds. So I'm really excited because as I share our screen here in a moment, we are working with the documentation side by side here. So, oops, wait, there. We're both here. We're up
Yes,
in the
we're
corner.
good.
Boo! But I should move us over to the bottom. Let's see. Too many of us. In the meantime, though, give us a quick little summary, Natalie, of what we are going to be covering today. And tell us a little bit about what it was like for you when you first worked with an API for this project that you built.
So today we're going to be exploring the Spotify API. We're just going to be writing the JavaScript for a really simple HTML page that will show you new Spotify releases or newly released albums on Spotify and all of the tracks on those albums. And the Spotify API is really well documented. It has like example requests for all of its endpoints and also like example projects and stuff. So it's definitely a good one to get started with because it's really easy to understand and it has a lot of just like helpful resources.
Okay, good. I'm not as scared anymore. I'm just getting our screen situated here. I just want to make it the most accessible, easiest possible. I'm going to do some moving around here. Alrighty, I'm going to move my VS Code window down a little bit. There we go. Do some swapping out here. All right. Da, 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 da. Perfection. And please, 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 as we are going along through this project, let us know in the comments if you have any questions along the way. We'll be happy to answer them. And Natalie, you're pretty much an expert at this point on the Spotify API. So I'm excited. I feel comfortable with you walking me through this.
Cool.
All right, let's see. I'm getting all my windows set up. So what's going to be the first thing that we are going to do to build this project, Natalie?
Well, there's one step that like anyone using the Spotify API has to do before doing a project that we're not really going to cover, but it's just to go to the Spotify developer console and make a client ID in secret and store those because anything involving the API will require those two things.
And this is mainly just to get access to the API, right?
Yeah.
Gotcha.
So if we look in VS Code, can you like move the VS Code window down a bit? Because I think my camera's like blocking it.
I'm gonna move it down right here. We'll just
like that's good. Yeah. So basically, this. Can you open up the project sidebar with like the files?
Yes.
The first one. Yeah. So basically, we already have a HTML and CSS page like made for this project. If you go into the HTML, it's really simple. It's like two divs, one for the albums and then one for the songs on each album, and like that's literally it. So that's what we're starting with, and then we're going to be making the app.js file, which is the JavaScript for our HTML page. So if we go back there, we're going to be writing these three controller modules, and basically this is like a style of programming called module-based programming where it's kind of like classes in Java, except JavaScript doesn't really have like classes. Actually, I think they actually add classes, but that's besides the point. And basically, each of these like controllers it's like a self-contained class / module where you can basically make private methods, private like variables, which allows you to like, separate functionality. And it's just like one style of programming that we kind of wanted to introduce. You don't like have to follow this in your own project, but
a good best practice and to get started on their own projects. Great.
How like the module, for sure. And how the module style works is that if you look at like just the first one, you want to look at inside the first set of parentheses, we have like a function declared. And this is basically like the function where we're going to be writing like all of our code for that module, so all of its methods and stuff. And then you'll notice that there's like a second set of just empty parentheses, and this basically creates like an immediately invoked function expression. They're called like ifs, and it means that this function will be initialized upon creation. And if you like think about any other like normal function call you're making, like if you have a function called like, I don't know, like hello, and you want to call it, you would also add these empty parentheses because that's what indicates you like want to call a function and you're not just referring to the actual like function object. So in the same way here, we have in the first set of parentheses a function declaration, and the second set of parentheses is just calling it upon like initialization, because that is part of the entire module system where we basically use these modules that are like immediately initialized. So yeah. And another kind of important feature is that everything inside this module is actually private unless specifically revealed. And what this means is that if I'm like declaring a variable inside here, like so, this cannot be accessed outside of this module. If you wanted to give something like outside the scope of this function access, you have to put it inside a return object. So anything you specify inside this return object is going to be like a public variable or method. So like in an object format, you could go like that. And then outside of it, you would then be able to like access this, the high inside the return, but not this like other variable that is not declared, that is not like specifically returned. And that's like just another good feature because it allows you to actually have like private and public variables, which is always like good practice. So you're not polluting, you know, like you're not having like a bunch of global variables that might interfere with each other.
Absolutely.
This will probably become like more clear. Yeah.
When we're programming today, I'm sure we'll go into this in more detail, but how do you make a decision on what functions live under, you know, API controller versus, you know, app controller? Is that sort of as you program, you're filling in each one, or as a developer, how are you thinking through that process?
Well, it's definitely like a general design decision that you make before you start coding, because obviously you have these like two distinct parts of your project. One part is like direct interaction with the Spotify API and getting data from there. And the second part is like interaction with our HTML page. So definitely like, I think you should like be thinking about what modules you want beforehand. And I think the methods will like also, you can like plan them beforehand, but also like come as we need them and write the modules, I think.
Exciting stuff. Alrighty. Should we dive in?
Yeah, then we'll get started. So the first thing we want to do is work on the API controller. And this, again, is the one that is going to be like directly making HTTP requests to the Spotify API, getting authorized with the Spotify API, stuff like that. So the first thing we want to do is make two variables, two constants for our client ID and client secret.
Okay. And that's
so
going to go
inside that module on line 2, we're just going to declare 2. And you would set them equal to like your client ID and secret. We're just going to initialize them to like empty strings for now.
Okay. So we're doing, and this is a constant client ID. You know, I'm thinking about it, and I don't think I've built a project personally with the Spotify API, but I just know so many people who have worked with the Spotify API that it feels like I've worked with it, especially on this project initially when you were building it. All right, I'm going to actually do double parentheses, double quotes there. Okay, cool. So
and basically, yeah, so we can actually start writing like actual methods now. And this is where we kind of want to refer to the Spotify documentation. So our app is pretty simple because we're only accessing public data, like the new releases or anything involving like a public playlist is all data that like anyone can access. Where it gets more complicated is when you want to access like a user's personal playlist or like top songs. That's where it gets a little harder, but we're, you know, taking it slow.
Sure. So we're not accessing a stream of any kind or like a user stream or an individual stream.
Yeah.
We're just accessing like, hey, what is the data for this particular week? Great. Easy.
So even though we're not doing user data, we still have to get our app authorized, or maybe it's authenticated. Don't remember which one. But basically, if you go to your Chrome tab, we're going to be using something called the client credentials flow, and this basically allows our app access to the Spotify web API's public endpoints, which are like anything involving public data. So basically how this workflow works is that if you scroll down a bit, there's actually this really nice flowchart. So our application will use our client ID and secret to request an access token. The Spotify account service will give us that access token, and in the future, whenever we like request data from the web API, we'll send over the token to prove that like our application is authorized to make requests. So yeah, inside our module, we're gonna create a new function called get token, and it's actually going to be underscore get token.
Okay, exciting stuff.
Yeah.
I am not as scared about this documentation. I'm seeing visuals. This is exciting stuff.
Yeah, which is very helpful.
Yeah, because I think so. It's funny. I was actually working this weekend with the Twitter API, and it was similar in nature, where you can get just information that exists versus live streaming information. So I think, to give an example to the students listening, if you're thinking about those projects, thinking about ideas for those projects out there, I don't know if you remember this, Natalie, but there was a series of Spotify billboards that had all this data on it, like 500,000 people listened to Britney Spears on repeat for like 2 hours or something. That's a fake statistic, of course, but I'm curious, with all that data that exists, it could be a really interesting, fun app to build. Free idea to the students of BitCamp out there. Anyway, back to the project. All right, I made underscore get token. Alrighty, and I assume this is going to get
And
our
that's going to be
token.
an asynchronous function.
Let's see, async.
Yes. And the reason for the underscore is that, just like conventionally, actually, I feel like I've seen this somewhere, but private methods sometimes have an underscore, and their corresponding public method will be like get token without the underscore.
Good format.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So we're going to use like the arrow function declaration here.
All right. And this is going to be here.
Yeah.
Alrighty.
So we want to now look at the documentation to see exactly how we should go about this. And they actually have steps, I believe. Yeah. So basically right here, how we request authorization is that we have to get an access token from this token endpoint of the account service. So we're going to be making a fetch request, and we also did this in week 2 when we were making requests to the Cognitive Services API. But as a refresher, we're going to go into the get token method and assign, say like const result or something is equal to the result of a fetch call.
Yes. Let's see. So the way that they have it, trying to find where in the documentation we have that, just so we can kind of show.
If you just scroll down, like this step 1.
Step 1, here we go.
Right here. The request is sent to the API endpoint.
Okay, so we're awaiting the Spotify API token, and then we have to get the credentials and put them into that URL. So we're getting it for our specific API call. And then let's see, what else do we have to do in there?
Basically, we just have to send over our client ID and secret in this post request, and then it'll return an access token that we just want to save.
Perfect.
That's all that this method is doing.
And we're using live share, so we can.
Do you want me to?
Sure, go for it, Natalie.
Yeah.
I'll let you drive.
So basically, we're going to declare this variable to store our result, and we're using await because fetch returns a promise, so we want to wait until that promise is resolved, or basically that means until like our request is fulfilled, hopefully. So as a refresher, the fetch function takes in 2 parameters, and the first one is just the endpoint. So I don't have the endpoint, but do you think you could copy paste it into that? It should be, it's like the accounts.spotify.com/API.
Yes, here you go. I will put it right in here for us. I love VSCode sharing abilities. This isn't an ad for VSCode.
Cool. So that's our endpoint. We don't really need to modify it or add anything in. And the second parameter is going to be an object that specifies like details of our call, like stuff like the method. And our method is post because it is what it says in the documentation. We should follow that.
Yes.
And if we look back at documentation, it specifies that we need a request body parameter and corresponding value. So you need to scroll down a bit. Yeah, so we're still in step 1 here. And it basically says the body of this post request must contain the following parameters encoded in this form. So we're actually going to add that right now. How we can do that is just specify body, and we're going to say the parameter name, which I think is grant type. And we're going to set that equal to what they want it to be, which is client credentials. And that's also the name of the authorization flow. So makes sense.
Essentially what we're doing is we're saying like, yo, Spotify, hey, what's up? It's me, Natalie, and Chloe. Here's our password. Please let us in. Let us have the data. And then they go, hold on. Okay, cool. This checks out. And then we get in.
Yeah.
It's a very simple way of what we're trying to write right now.
Yeah. And the last thing we have to do is we have to send over specify some headers. And this one, the first one is a little bit hard to find, but it says it must contain the parameters encoded in this like application or like that form URL encoded format. So we actually have to like directly specify that using the content type header. So if we do content type, and then we're going to set that equal to this. Can you copy paste over this like application /x?
Yes, I'm just looking at in the documentation. Oh, I see. Okay, so we have authorization and we also have content type. Okay, here is this. Mm-hmm. So how do you know what content type to put in here?
Yeah, so you just have to like read the documentation and it'll tell you what they want the data sent over as. Gotcha. If you like look right, do you see that token endpoint right at the top of the screen?
Oh yes,
like
right
the
here.
post. Perfection. Yeah, right underneath. It'll tell you. This one's like a little bit hidden, but
yes,
should be able to figure it out. And the second one is down here where it says the header of this post request must contain the following parameter. The parameter's name is authorization, so I'm going to add that in.
Right. And that is going to include, I would assume, our secret and probably
our client ID and secret. Yeah. So for this one, it's a little bit more complicated. They want this string. So it starts with basic and then a space and then your client ID : client secret, and that is encoded in base 64. So yeah, but there's a really handy function called B2A that will just encode that for us, so that's not actually that bad.
Okay, so wait, let's unpack that.
Yeah.
It's basic. Okay, so the authorization is, well, I guess we'll make more. Let's type it out first and then we'll go over it.
Yeah, sure. So basic, and then the part that's actually getting encoded is your client ID. And then the colon is actually very important. And then your client secret.
Okay, so that's a lot. Let's unpack that. So basic is, so it says in the documentation here, authorization basic, and then it says base 64 encoded client ID, client secret. So, all right, so we're doing BTOA, which you said was what?
It'll just encode whatever you're passing in base 64. Very
fantastic. Handy. And then, oh, amazing. And then that's taking our client ID and our client secret and that very important colon. All righty.
Yep.
Wow. That was a lot to unpack from what seems to be a very simple piece of code. There's a lot to unpack there.
Yeah.
All righty. What is next? Now that we did all of that fun stuff, so now we did the post request, and for anybody who maybe didn't join our previous stream, I think we covered this. Post request versus get request. Pretty easy to remember. When we're posting things, we're sending them out in the world, and when we're getting a get request or getting something, we're receiving information. So we're posting something to Spotify to get something back. All righty. What is next, Natalie?
Cool. So result now should have our access token somewhere in there. What we're going to do now is just get that in a JSON format. So just do result.json. We also did this in our Azure function, so it shouldn't be too foreign. But and then and also .json also returns a promise, so we still have to use await with it to make sure it is fully done. And then we'll have to return our access token in. You can find this in documentation. Okay, so right here in the example, this JavaScript object, like the access token type expires in, is what is being returned from the request. And this entire object is what is being stored in our data variable right now. So we really only care about the access token part. So we can just do return data dot access token, which will just grab that one attribute out of this object.
Great.
Yeah. So that's actually all we need for our get token method.
Simple.
Yeah,
simple
it's not
stuff.
bad.
And what is the information that we are getting? We're getting album tracks?
From this call specifically, we're just getting a long like access token string.
Or for the overall project, so like thinking onto the next function. So now that we are sending our credentials to get the information back, what is the information that we're like looking to grab?
Now that we have an access token, we want to go and ask the web API for new releases on Spotify.
Ooh, yes. Okay.
Cool.
Exciting.
So kind of like the get token method, we're just going to declare another function called get new releases or underscore get new releases.
Okay, and this is going to live, is this also under our, this is the same area, okay.
Yeah, everything kind of involving direct calls to the Spotify API will be in the API controller.
Perfect. So now get new releases will, it's a great function name. We know that it's going to get the new releases for us.
Yeah. And this time we're actually going to pass in parameters. So token, which will be like our access token for the call, and then limit, which will be the number of songs that we want, or the number of new releases that we want.
Okay.
Cool. So basically, I think you have the documentation for this endpoint pulled up on your next tab.
Yes. Here we
go. So for all of Spotify's like endpoints, they have like a pretty comprehensive page for each one.
Simple enough. New releases.
Yeah. So we're pretty much going to do the same thing we did for the token. It's pretty similar, except it's not a post request. But do you want me to write it or?
Sure. If you want to write it, and then I can follow along, or whatever is easiest here.
Okay.
Let's see. So this is get new releases.
That works.
And you said we need a token and a limit. Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the first thing we want to do is just kind of the same thing. We're going to make a fetch request, and this time the endpoint is just like at the top with get. You can see it, and it's just like the api.spotify.com/releases, and we're going to add that in here. And I'm going to use backticks here because we're actually going to like add in a couple parameters. So if you scroll down in the documentation, you can see that there are certain query parameters that you can actually add. And all of these are optional, but I'm not going to do country or offset because we don't need those. But for limit, for this project, I just want 10 songs. This is like kind of an arbitrary number, but
yeah,
just
simple enough.
Yeah. And to add query parameters, you can basically just add like a question mark right here. And then the format of query parameters is like the parameter name and then equals value. So the name that we have right here is limit. And then we're going to set that equal to, you could put 10 here, but just, I'm just going to set it equal to the parameter and then pass it in later just because.
Perfect.
Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yes, I'm just making sure that we can see all of this lovely code. There we go. I'm gonna make this window a little smaller. Whoop, there we go. Alrighty. So yes, we're setting the limit to limit, and great. And we're just adding that on to the end of that API. So basically we're just building a URL here.
Yeah. And once we have our URL thing, we're going to again specify the details. So this time it's a GET request, and you know that because documentation has like a big GET right next to the endpoint. And also we're not actually like sending them any data. We just want them to tell us like what are the top releases.
We want the information of the new releases versus giving them our information.
Yeah. And this call is like a lot simpler actually. The only thing we have to send over, okay, that's not caps, is our access token. So the whole point of getting the access token was to make calls to the web API. So now that we actually have our token, we just want to be sending it over with our request. And if you look at the documentation, there's an area for header fields, and the name is authorization. So we're going to specify that, authorization.
So this is similar to our previous function then.
Yeah. And this part is actually like not specified very well. If you go back and look in like the authorization guide, I think it might tell you, but it's kind of hard to find. Instead of only sending over your access token, you actually need to say like bearer space and then your actual token.
Okay.
That's just like what the API requires, and this part is a little hard to find.
See, that's what scares me about APIs, Natalie. Those gotchas.
Yeah, sometimes they don't specify, but
see, this is why we made this video, so people will know. They'll know to put
so
bearer.
people know.
Okay, so we've got our bearer token. We did that on the previous one as well, right? Or no, it was a little bit different on our previous one.
It's a little bit different because this one is actually like getting your app authorized, so
that's right.
It's slightly different, but yeah. But we're gonna do the same thing over here. Underneath our result call, we're also gonna just get the data in a JSON format, and then what we want to return here is data.albums.items.
Gotcha.
And the reason for this is
10 items that
it's going to give us like an array of 10 albums. And you can if you look at the documentation, they have like an example called somewhere in the page.
Yes. Oops, I'm clicking on different things here. Let me minimize this. There we go. Alrighty.
Yeah, so in this response format thing, this is like an example response, and you can see that it has a lot of information, and data.albums.items is just how we're accessing the list of 10 albums.
Okay.
So if you look at the top here, yeah, so this entire object has like this albums attribute. So at the very top, there's like this albums array thing. Do you see? It's like the second line.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so this albums object has like all of the information inside, and then out of that we just want to grab items, which is the actual list of 10 albums.
Gotcha. So we want this section here.
Yeah, so that's why we're doing data.albums.items.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah.
And are we calling, do we need all of this information for the project that we're building? Like, do we need the artist, and like, how do you, I guess it depends on what project you're building, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, we do need the entire track object or the album object, because that has like the name, ID, and artist. We're not going to be using like all attributes of the album object, but yeah, we do need like all the names and stuff.
Okay.
So that's why we're grabbing it.
Awesome. So I'm grabbing this.
Yeah. So once we get new releases, the last thing our API has to be able to do is to get all the tracks from an album, because we basically want to be showing the newly released albums, and then when the person like clicks on an album, it'll show all of the tracks in that album. Okay. So yeah, so if you go back to Chrome, the last endpoint that we're going to be using is called like get an albums tracks.
Da, 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 da.
So this is formatted like pretty much the exact same as the other endpoint.
Looks
So
very
we're going to be writing
familiar.
like, yeah, it's going to be a really similar function. So I'm just going to copy paste actually the old code.
Perfect. Yeah, because it even has the limit offset. We've got
Yeah.
marked on this one, but
I think we're going to call it get album tracks. And
good.
the one thing that is different about this endpoint is that you need to be passing in an album ID so it knows like what album tracks it's getting, or what album it's getting tracks from. Okay.
Gotcha.
So we're going to add a parameter here called album ID.
I'm gonna.
And that will specify like what album we want to be getting information from.
Perfect.
Cool. And then using the documentation, we're going to grab the endpoint again. And stick it in
this
here.
one up here.
Yeah. So if you notice, they have this like little bracketed section for the ID.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to replace that with our album ID parameter.
Perfect. And then we can
Like
just
so.
refer to that inside the function.
Yeah. And then I'm also going to add on this limit equals because I think I'm going to have this open just in case it has more than some. Cool. And then if you notice, like down here, our entire like the rest of our fetch call is the exact same because it's also get, and we also have the same exact authorization. So we don't have to change anything. The only thing we have to really alter at the end is that the object that this API call will return is slightly different. It's not going to be a list of album objects. So all we have to do is change that to data.items. And if you look at the documentation and scroll down, you should be able to see a example.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. So over here, if you go up a bit,
all right.
Yeah, you can see that there's like an items on like line 4. It should be
line 4 right here.
Yeah, this items array is basically what has like all of your actual data. So we're going to be referencing it.
Gotcha. So first we're getting the new releases, and then from the new releases, we're getting the information from the new releases. So it's like a box in a box.
Yeah.
All right. That makes sense because we need, which also makes sense why we have an asynchronous function, because in order to get one, we need the other. Well, we have to get authorized, which was step 1, which is what we did. And then we're getting the new releases and then the album track names. Ooh, exciting stuff. Okay. So,
and just like there's a question in the chat about what an endpoint is.
Ooh, good question.
Do you want to take it?
Sure, yeah. So when you're dealing with APIs specifically, typically there's an endpoint involved. So you probably noticed when we were going through the documentation on these, up here, it says endpoint, obviously in bold. But what that really means is there are get endpoints and there are post endpoints with APIs typically. What this is the API endpoint that we need in order to get the information that we need from this API. So in this particular case, so for the one that we just did, we've done a couple on this particular stream. So to get an album's tracks, we would use this get format of an endpoint. And you can see they have these curly brackets here for ID. And ID is just existing to be a placeholder for what the ID of the particular album ID that we need. And then similarly with these other ones, so we have another endpoint here to get a list of new releases. You can see really the only difference between these are what we're asking for in the API, right? So it's basically just an endpoint URL that we are accessing in order to either post information or get information. I'm just scrolling up here to show you an example of post one. I believe this is the post one, right, Natalie? Maybe I scrolled too far. But post, for example, we would post to an endpoint in order to give our credentials. Yes. I believe I said that right. Right, Natalie?
Yeah, and an endpoint in general is like just a place where you make an API call to. This is like often just like a web URL.
Yes.
But yeah, if you want to access an API's resources, the endpoint is where you have to like send your request to.
So here's an example of an endpoint that's like in the code. So I think this one, they're accessing a particular album. I'm curious what this is. What if I just put this? So what would happen if I just put this in my URL, Natalie? Let's just put it
I think it
in.
should take you. This is just like a URL to the actual like
Just take
web
us
player
there.
album.
There we go. So it takes us to Place in the Sun. So yeah, these basically just exist as the different endpoints that we need to either get the information that we need from the song or the album, and lots of fun get and post request learning to be done on endpoints, as I'm sure Natalie can tell you.
So our API controller is almost done, and the last thing we have to do is actually reveal a couple public methods. And because right now everything we've written is private, so like outside of this function scope, you can't access anything, which is a problem.
Mm-hmm.
So when you do module programming, how you reveal methods is through a return object. So you can just specify this by saying return and then curly braces for an object. And inside here, anything that we specify will be public. So what we want people to be able to access are our three methods. So how we're going to do this is we're going to say get token. And notice that there's no underscore this time because it's going to be a public method. You can say, and inside we're just going to return our like private get token method. And this seems kind of redundant, but it's just like good practice to have like public versus private methods. And there are certain like methods that you wouldn't reveal. Like I think you could also just like keep all of the token stuff inside our controller and never reveal it, but this is just how we did it this time. So but yeah, this return object basically allows you to control what exactly people what exactly like stuff outside of our module can access. So we have get token, and then we're also going to reveal the get new releases, and then this will also have the same parameters as our private method, which is token and limit.
Perfect.
So we're going to do the same thing, return get new releases.
So basically we're calling a public version of the private methods that we created.
Yeah. And then get album tracks. And then we have an extra parameter, album ID. So, yeah.
Okay. All right.
This is our API controller module is done.
We did a lot.
So it's basically, yeah.
Let's see. So we got our token. We got the new releases in a function, and then we created a function that would then get the use the token, and then from the new releases get the album tracks. Seems very simple, but lots of legwork.
Yeah,
but we got
like
it done.
Stuff. Yeah. Cool. So now we have our module with 3 public methods that we can use to interact with Spotify API. So that's good. And the next step here is to work on our UI controller. And we're actually not going to write this one from scratch because it's just a lot of like handling HTML, changing like the DOM elements and stuff. So I'm just gonna copy paste in the code for this controller and then kind of like explain it briefly.
Okay.
But it's mostly just like manipulating HTML, which shouldn't be too confusing for anyone.
Okay, cool. So these are constant DOM elements. Okay, this seems simple enough. Hidden token, album list, and song list. Those are basically the 3 things that we wanted returned to us.
Yeah, and the hashtag, so basically this DOM elements object is just like the IDs of any HTML elements that we want to be able to manipulate. So here, the hashtag specifies ID. If it was like a class name, it'd be a period. But basically our album list is where we're going to display all the new releases. The song list div is where we're showing all the songs or the tracks in each album. And then we also have this hidden token div, which is just like a div that will not be displayed, but it's just there so we can actually store our token somewhere. It's kind of like a finicky way to store our token, but yeah.
Sounds good.
Does that make sense?
Yes. I want to just reiterate, like, we're doing it for the sake of like practicing it, but you know, when you're doing API calls, we have other ways that we can show you how to do
Yeah.
that. But this works best for this particular use case for sure. And I think, it first, the person who asked in the chat earlier who was saying like, how can I think of an endpoint? Like literally what we are doing here is from that endpoint, like we are grabbing these three things pretty much from that web page.
Mhm.
Like if that's like an easier way to kind of wrap your head around that concept, like we're just literally going to this song and we're saying, hello, here's the three things that we need, and it's giving it back to us. So great. Okay. We've got
Yeah.
our, and then the hidden token is a little bit different, but it's information that we need to get the request.
Yeah. So then we have our return object, which is actually a little bit long this time. So the first thing is this input field. This isn't like necessary, but because we want stuff in the UI controller to be like accessed through the UI controller, we're basically just returning references to like the actual document objects that we want to change. You could just access these like outside with the same like query selector thing, but we just want to like show that these inputs are like part of the UI, part of the HTML page, and that's why this object exists. It's not super necessary.
Okay.
And then second that we have is this album create album detail thing. So if you scroll down just like to this function, what this does is the first thing we do is we have this like detail div. This is just a reference to our actual like album list div where everything will get displayed. And then we have this HTML very long string that is just like an HTML element, but in string form.
Okay.
And if you just look at it, it's a div, and the ID, this part is actually quite important. We're giving it the ID of the album.
Okay.
So create album detail takes in a parameter for the album that it's creating like a display for. And in the div that we're making, the ID is the album.id. Because for a Spotify album track, each album has like a ID that's just like a list of characters that you use to kind of like identify it, especially for like API requests.
Sure.
So we're saving that in the ID attribute because we're going to need it later. There's a class that's not that important, and the image is basically the album image. This is how you access an image. If you go look at the documentation for like an album, I don't think it'll be there. You'll probably have to like look up Spotify album object or something like that.
Yeah, because I'm curious why we have a 2 there.
The 2 is because each album has 3 corresponding images, and they're actually all the same image, just the size is different.
Oh.
So the 2 is accessing like a small size.
Let's see. Maybe it's under this one.
Yeah, I think that you should album object. Yeah.
Popularity, release date. I guess I can just search. What are we saying? Art, album.
We're looking for images. Yeah, here, images. So there's an array, and then the images aren't actually different. It's just like the different objects in the array are just different sizes.
Gotcha. All right. That makes sense. Cool. So we're running 2 because that's the size and the stuff.
Yeah, that's like the small size. And then we're just showing the album name, which can be accessed through album.name. There's a line break, and then album.artist.name. And the 0 is because like technically multiple artists can work on a track, but I just like displayed the first one.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. So
cool.
this is giving us all of the album details.
Mm-hmm. And then finally, you're inserting this entire HTML string into your page using insert adjacent HTML.
Perfect.
Yeah. Right. So basically this function takes in an album object, and then for that album object, we'll create an entry on your HTML page that has like the name of the album and the artist that worked on it and an image.
Oh my gosh. It's so amazing that we can get all of that information just from one API call. Like you don't have to go and source like the album art from like different places. It's just boom, we get all of it. Amazing. Yeah. Okay.
It's all in one object. And this second method is called create track detail, and it's like literally the exact same thing except doing it for a track instead of an album. So it has like the same exact layout. Except this time we're going to be putting HTML into our song list division versus our album list div. So yeah, the HTML is a little bit simpler. It just has like a track name being shown.
Yes.
Yeah, and then we're sticking that HTML into our other div.
And we really
That
don't
makes
need
sense.
anything else besides the track name. I mean, I'm sure there's other
Yeah,
information we can get, but in this case,
yeah.
all
And
right.
then we have like other methods down here. So there's one called clear track detail. And we need this because every time we click on a new album, we want the songs from the old albums that we've clicked on to be cleared out. Correct?
Gotcha.
Yeah. So this
Okay.
will basically just clear that div. So you can like put in new stuff. It's just kind of like a helper thing. And then we have these two methods that are called set token and get token. And these are like kind of like getters and setters for our hidden token element. We're using that hidden div to store our token so we can like access it. And this is just how we're storing it and getting it.
Yes. Amazing. Okay. So then really all we have left, well, we've pretty much written everything that we need to get it going. We've got get token, we've got set token. We're clearing the track detail between them. We're getting the track detail. We are creating the album detail. Is there anything else that we're missing? That's pretty much
Yeah, for interactions with our HTML page, that's pretty much all we need.
amazing. All right. So, how do we make the magic happen, Natalie? We got all of this
So
information from the API, and which still feels like witchcraft to me. I feel like you're a sorceress of the Spotify API here. You know exactly. I can tell you've studied this documentation well. So let's see what is left for us to do then.
So basically, our two modules here are like objects that have the capability and methods to interact with our page and the Spotify API, but aren't actually like, we haven't actually told them like what exactly to do. So this last one, it's called the app controller, will basically kind of like set up the workflow for like our actual application using the modules that we've written. And
Okay.
how this works is that our app controller will actually take parameters and we're going to call them API control, UI control. And these will be references to these modules that we've written, which are actually like stored in variables so we can reference them. And how we're going to reference them is that if you look at the two empty parentheses here, this is what is making our immediate function call.
Okay.
And just like any other function with parameters, like get token, for example, when you call it, you need to pass in like stuff like that, right?
Mm-hmm.
So when we actually make our call, because we have parameters here, we need to pass in our actual controllers.
Oh, so what we
Okay,
built,
controller.
basically what we just built.
Yeah, exactly. So these two modules are what we've declared above, and now we're going to be using them in our like actual app. So
Amazing.
yeah. So the first thing we're going to do here is, this is kind of just like a helper variable. I'm going to call this DOM input equals UI control dot input field. So the input field object is something we returned in our UI controller, and it basically contains references to our HTML album div and song div.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, so
So,
I'm just gonna,
and those are constant inputs on there because we're always going to have those on the page. Because, yeah,
yeah,
basically the page is serving those two pieces of
yeah.
information. Okay.
So once we have that, the first thing we need to do is actually tell the API controller to like actually get the new releases and then display them on the screen. Because right now we have methods for them, but they've never actually been called, right?
Right. They have the potential to exist, but they don't exist yet.
Yeah. So we're gonna create a function called the load releases, and just declare that as a function. And it's gonna be async because we're going to be calling methods above that use like the await keyword and also async functions. So this one also needs to be async because we need to await the result of our request to the Spotify API. If that makes sense.
Yes. So we're loading the new, I see, because we have to wait on the token, and
Hmm.
then we have to set the token and then await
Yeah,
the albums to come back. Gotcha.
yeah. So basically, the first thing we need to do is actually get a token. So how we're going to do this is using the method that we wrote. So API control is this parameter we have up here, which is a reference to our API controller. So how we get the token is using the method that we wrote, which is called getToken, like so. And because this is an async function, it returns a promise, which means that you have to use the word await with it.
Okay.
Yeah.
I,
And then we're actually going to store the token. So we're going to use the set token method, like so. And this will basically just save our token inside this like invisible HTML element that we can then like use later.
and we'll have it available to us.
Exactly. And then we actually have to get a list of new releases. And again, we're just going to be using our pre-written methods called get new releases. And then we're going to pass in our token and then 10 because we only want 10 songs.
Perfect. And then we need the detail of the albums that we get back.
Yeah, so basically we have this object right now and we need to display it on the screen. And how we're going to do that is using our create album detail function that is in our UI controller. So how we can access that is we're just going to, so basically this create album detail function takes in one album and then makes like a display for that. So we need to kind of like loop through this entire albums array and then make an entry for every single album.
Okay.
So we're going to use for each.
Albums for each.
Yeah, so this for each like function is just like a JavaScript. It's like an easy way to loop over an array instead of writing like a full-on for loop.
Oh, I love
then,
this. This is one of my new favorite JavaScript tips.
So for each, this element thing is just a reference to each like object in your array. It doesn't matter what you call it. I'm going to call it an album. So then inside this function, album is the like you know how you would traditionally like access it through like album 0 or like albums I,
Sure.
something like that. Album is just like your reference to each like index of your array, basically.
Okay, so
So
for every
when you're looping
album,
through,
we want
yeah, every album you want to create an album detail like that.
Perfect, and then that just iterates through every single one on the list.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Perfection. Okay.
So basically, load new releases is a class that will get a token, store the token, get all the new releases, and then create like a display on your HTML page for every single new release.
For every album that we have on. Mm-hmm. Amazing. Okay. So much in such a small amount of code. All right.
And then the second part is that now we gotta just like imagine that we have an HTML page with like a list of 10 albums. We want to make it so that whenever a person clicks on the name of an album, the tracks for that album are shown.
Okay. We can do that.
We're gonna, yeah, it'll be great. So we need to add a event listener to our album tracks, and basically how we can do that is, so DOM inputs is our reference to like all of the possible HTML elements that we want to change.
Sure.
So if we want to add an event listener to our entire albums div, we can just do DOM inputs .albums, and this is a reference to our album div.
Okay, gotcha.
And we can do add
we're
event
literally
listener,
just
like
adding an event listener to the already existing albums. Great. Okay.
Yeah. So when you add an event listener, the first parameter you specify is the type. So there are types that are like change, stuff like that. We're going to do click, which just means like whenever it's clicked. And then the second parameter is like what you want to happen when the click happens or when the object is clicked. So this is like typically a function that you want like to run whenever someone clicks.
Okay.
So we're just going to declare like a straight up function inside here, like so.
All right.
And this E, yeah, the E is the event. So like whenever the listener like detects a click, there's like an event that is generated, and it can be accessed through this E parameter.
Perfect. All right.
Cool. So the first thing we're going to do is e.prevent default, and this basically prevents the page from reloading, which we don't want.
Okay.
Because we just want like the information to pop up. There's no
within
reload
the page
involved.
versus the entire
Yeah.
page. Okay.
Mm-hmm. And whenever someone clicks on a new album, we want to clear the details of the old one. So this is why we needed our clear track detail.
That's
going
why
to
we
call
wrote that earlier. That makes sense.
Yeah. And then now we basically have to use our get album tracks method that we created earlier. And
we're
to
pulling
do that,
it all
we first
together.
need a token. Yeah.
Okay.
So we first need to get a token, and instead of, we don't want to like call this get token method again, because that'll actually generate like a new token and kind of like override the old one, which is just like not that effective. So we actually can just do url.ui control.get token, which is where we stored our first generated token.
Oh, perfect. So that way we're not like hitting the limit as well on how many we can grab.
Exactly. So once we have our token, we can say we want the tracks of an album. So we do tracks equals, and then we're just calling the get album tracks method that we wrote. So get album tracks. And in here we have token, and then we actually have this album ID parameter that we need to have. And if you remember, if you scroll up a bit to create album detail.
Let's see, create track detail
in UI controller. Create out. Wait, go down a bit. Sorry.
Yeah.
A little bit down. Create album detail. Yeah, here.
There we go.
So you notice that in our div, we set ID equal to the album.id.
Yes.
Right.
Okay. So we're referring back to that.
So exactly. So we need to do this so that when someone clicks on the actual div, we know the actual ID of the album that it's referring to. Perfect. So if we go back down to app controller, we're actually going to get the album ID, and how we can do that is, so the event refers to like the event that the listener has detected, which is a click event. And if you do e.target, this is like the element that was clicked, which would be whatever album that the person clicked on. And then to access the ID, because we added in like a ID element to our actual album division, this is, yeah, this contains the album ID because we specified that earlier in our create album detail.
Perfect.
So that's why that is important. So now we have our ID, and we can pass that into our get album tracks call. And then the last parameter is the limit, which we're going to set as 10 again, just because. Cool.
All right.
Makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. So basically we're saying on this event, and wait, what was the target? I already forgot what, on
the target.
Event,
so the event object refers to like the click event. The target refers to like the actual place that you clicked on, or like the actual element that you clicked on. So that would be like whatever album you clicked on.
And that is where the ID, right. We're using the ID. Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
And then the last thing to do here is the same thing we did for albums. So we're going to loop through this tracks array, and then for each track here, we can delete this. We're going to do create track detail for the individual track. Does that make sense?
Yes. Okay. So now it looks like we've create track detail. Perfect. So now we have the track detail for each track when the event occurs. We get 10 of them, and then for each track, it goes through them. Woo! We did it!
Yeah.
I can
And
see it in my
then,
brain.
so the last thing we have to do here is actually give it a way to like start the entire app, which basically just
Yes.
means calling this load new releases thing. So we're gonna add a public method here called init, which will basically just like is a method that people
Initialize.
call, yeah, to start our entire project. So basically all that this does is call our load new releases function, because that is that's what we need to be called immediately so that the person can see all new songs, right?
And that sets off our chain of events of what we need in order to display the information we need to share. Okay.
Exactly.
We covered a lot.
So yeah, and the very last line of code that we actually need is app controller down here dot init. So this is actually calling our init function.
Okay. All right. So we made a bunch of functions. We used a lot of the Spotify API. I'm learning a lot about the capabilities here. I'm hoping that the BitCamp students are getting some ideas on ways to maybe use either this API or an API like this. Start thinking about ways you can use different pieces and features of data. So now that we've done this, do we have a demo that we can kind of share? Should I share your screen, Natalie, maybe? And that could, let's share what we
Yeah.
have created here to give a visual. Let me know when you're ready and I will switch us over here.
Yeah, can you share my screen now?
Here we go. All right, here we go. Perfect.
Can you see
All right.
the?
Yes.
Okay, so this is I'm running this with the live server extension on VSCode. So these 10 tracks are the new releases taken from the Spotify API. And whenever you click on one, it'll tell you like, well, these are technically albums, but a lot of them are like singles. So there's only one track. But like this one is an album, and it'll show you all
what's so
of the
cool
songs on that
is
album.
we wrote all of this HTML in our JavaScript. Like that's the coolest part of all of this to me is like the way that we were able to make all of these divs just within like this was such a nice simple way of explaining the Spotify API. So thank you, Natalie. This is very
Yeah,
helpful to
no
break
problem.
down because just look at how many pieces of information we can get from like just getting our token and getting like the different credentials that we need. Like we could have technically put more in here, I bet. Like just looking at the documentation here, like I've got it open on my side. We could put images, but we could also put like like you said, multiple artists, the popularity integer, the release date. So pretty like once you get a hold of how to utilize APIs, like the world's sort of at your fingertips at what you're able to build. How would
Yeah,
you
for sure.
say, because your first time working with the Spotify API or an API in general, right, was for your Bit project. What advice do you have to the Bit project students or for anyone tuning in for getting started with an API? Obviously, good documentation is helpful. But what are your tips and tricks?
I'd say like look for example projects because the best way to see how it works is to like look at how someone else has used it. Yeah, like if the documentation comes with examples, like that's even better. Like the Spotify one actually allows you to like make example requests and see like what data is actually being returned. Or like test stuff out on Postman too if you want to like
Postman,
see.
which
Yeah.
we have in a previous video that I'll link in our show notes. But yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think that Twilio, if you're looking for a great beginner documentation to start with, they have an interactive game actually called Twilio Quest that you can play through to learn how to do the API. But I think I was mentioning this to you maybe before the stream, Natalie, but I spent my weekend hacking on a Twitter bot that I'm working on using the Twitter API with my friend PJ. And we
Mhm.
literally, I have the same advice that you do, Natalie, because, I'm a senior cloud advocate at Microsoft, and I still look at other tutorials and open source projects to help navigate a lot of these APIs, because sometimes the
Yeah.
documentation isn't the most straightforward, or there's kind of those gotchas or catch, like the bearer thing that we ran into today,
Yeah.
that sometimes they're hard to explain. But
Mhm.
we actually ended up watching a tutorial on how to build a similar project using the Twitter API, and we're repurposing that for our own bots. So I couldn't agree more. I think the more experience you get with APIs, the better, because you're going to use them a lot in your career as a software engineer, obviously. But this was such a fun project to get started with it. And what homework can our bit campers expect? What are they going to be working on using? Are they using APIs? What's our sneak peek, Natalie?
They actually, the homework this week is going to be optional because I want them to start working on their actual projects.
Oh,
But
nice. Wow.
if they wish, there's an assignment out there for them to get recommendations with the Spotify API.
Ooh, exciting. I recommend doing it. And if you get stuck, Natalie is a pro at it, and I can help you as well. I think I'm experienced now. Now that we've walked through this together, I feel more
Yeah.
comfortable. But yeah, I agree. I think as the students are starting to think of their projects, like, I don't know, let's say that you're using, what's another fun API that I like to use? There's a lot of really fun and interesting open data sets out there that, if you're looking to map any sort of information or do a heat map of everywhere where there's an in and out. You can go in there and use anything like the Bing Maps, Google Maps API, anything like that
Mhm.
to very similarly access different, I think in the same way that we showcased on here, like here's how you get album information and track information. Think of that in the same way as you're thinking of your projects with, oh, if I get a business from Bing Maps, then what are the hours and how would I access that within there? So all of this fun programming that y'all are going to be doing over the next couple weeks. I'm so excited to hear about these projects. All righty. I think that's it for today, right, Natalie?
Mhm. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, Bit project students and everyone else tuning in, thank you for joining us. We got some really good we had someone in the chat asking
Yeah. The code will get posted later
yes, we will
in the
post the
Slack.
code, and I'll also provide some links to the GitHub repos as well. All right, Natalie, I'll let you go off into the night. I'm sure you have some homework or some
Mhm.
important non-Spotify related work to do, but thanks for joining us again. And do we have a stream next week? We have
No,
one.
this is actually the last one because they're
It's
going to
the
start
last
really
one.
grinding on their projects soon.
And now the end is near. All right. Well, it has been lovely streaming these. I am so excited to start working on doing the final project presentations and getting all of these projects out into the world to see. So, bye, Bit Project students. Goodbye, anybody tuning in for fun, and we'll see you in the classes coming up. Bye, y'all.
Yeah.
All right. And